Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me post-lunch on a Friday. I consistently get Friday talks, so I'm excited to see so many people in the room. Today, I'm going to talk to you about changes you can make to your workflows to make maps more accessible, which I'm sure everyone saw in the schedule, but just in case you don't know why you're here. I want to give a quick note that accessibility design includes more than low vision and blind design use cases, but my talk is focused primarily on those design conversations, and I want to just say that it still matters to discuss beyond that, but that's just what my talk is currently focused on. Before giving all the tips and tricks, I also want to explain why I'm giving this talk, and I will also share resources more, and then also pose many questions. So not shockingly, I have a ton of things in 20 minutes, so if I talk fast, I apologize, and I also realized I just forgot to put captions on, which I told literally everybody I talked to that I was worried about forgetting. So you can't have an accessible talk without captions. I will say this room has had issues with Wi-Fi, and these are connected to Wi-Fi, so if that does happen, I will be sharing these slides. I'm going to make sure there's some annotated descriptions after. Okay, the end on that side. So why is because, as my intro noted, I care a lot about things and sharing information, and I certainly am no expert in any of all the things, but I like trying to be and learning, and everyone at my organization at GreenInfo Network, we've all been constantly trying to learn how to make things better. Our mission is mapping for good, and that includes also improving the way that we design maps and make maps. And we've been consistently frustrated, just like probably most people in the room, in finding the right resources for making maps specifically more accessible, because there's plenty of stuff out there that isn't map specific. And there certainly are great tutorials out there, but there's no Slocum text, there's no semiology of graphics, and whatever other Bibles people are used to finding as resources for cartographic things. Last year, we gave a 3-hour workshop and a 2-hour panel trying and attempting to share everything that we learned alongside other people as well. But today is not 2 hours or 3 hours, it's 20 minutes. So I'm going to just, like I said, give you tips and tricks, and I'd like to pose that as a potato. And that doesn't make sense. I'm not telling you to map with potatoes, but I'm asking you to think of a potato as how you would implement your workflows, because potatoes individually are not heavy, but when in the large sack, they might be, especially if you're not used to carrying sacks of potatoes. As I noted, potato sacks are heavy, and there's a ton of things to do when you're saying that a potato is a task in a workflow. And if you have, well, if you have many potato sacks, you're not going to be able to carry them all at once and certainly not get them to your destination in a minute. If you have a project where you really want to improve accessibility design in it and you only have a day or a week, you're not going to figure out all the solutions in that time. Oh, God. Well, now all my jokes were seen. I'm sorry. So this is what you would look like if you were attempting to lift heavy potato sacks without, having training. And just a fun note, it is officially the term potato face when you're deadlifting and powerlifting. So don't do that. Start with just lifting one potato. Or more formally, I guess, start taking out potatoes slowly and peeling them slowly and identifying things over time. If you just remember to think of things task-based rather than the overwhelming many things, it's really helpful. And if you've heard me give in other talks, I often will talk about aesthetic elements, so I was delighted that I could break things down again into just building blocks, because I guess that's my thing. Potatoes are building blocks in this talk, so you will see photos of potatoes the whole time. To get more serious, in order to make sure your maps are accessible, you do want to be referring to ADA compliance, Americans with Disabilities Act. There is information in there about contrast and text rules to make sure things are compliant. Again, this is very visual focused. What's also great is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a global space that people contribute to and share, also contains effectively everything that's in ADA compliance, plus a lot more. So those are two great resources. Now, it is like really heavy, a lot of information, but what's excellent is that WCAG especially has a lot of people writing about all that stuff, and giving tutorials. Not everything is map-based, but it still is useful because it's important to think outside of cartography and think about design spaces and think about other spaces where we can glean information. And it's definitely hard. Ideally, I would love to see in a few years or however long it takes to have cartographic principles around accessibility. But while we are where we are, we have to be looking outside of where we are to make things better. So I kind of categorize things in a weird way because print and basic web maps are not the same, but for the premise of my talk, I'm just kind of talking about simple elements in basic web maps, and the next part where I talk about web maps is when they're like really interactive and complex. And this is a map that some folks from my team made who are in the audience, I believe. I can't see where you are. Megan and Stephanie and Joseph also helped to contribute in many thoughts that go into this talk. If you see them, chat with them too. And this is just a clip from the full map, but I wanted to utilize it to highlight that you can make beautiful maps that have accessible information on it, because I think that's often where people get stuck, that a lot of accessibility related maps often people deem ugly. And some of the important things to think about when creating these things, these changes, is that you never want to have things indicated by color alone. You want to make sure that you're differentiating in many ways from line thickness, shading and fill, symbology, and labeling. Labeling specifically, it's really helpful if you're using different typefaces because, say, like, for whatever reason, a printer's not working, so the contrast isn't the right way that you designed it. There's still other ways in which it can be differentiated. Symbology as well, like making sure there's shape changes to help reinforce that alongside everything else that you might be including is important. Make sure you're making your text larger. The standard for ADA and WCAG is 18-point font or 14-point if it's bold. So that's what you should do. People probably often have read about making sure there's halos everywhere, and I think this is often where people get stuck because it's increasing contrast in a lot of elements across the map. I do think it can be done in a nice way, and I also think remembering that you can do more than just white is important. As long as you're testing and like seeing what works across the map, I think you can find beautiful ways of figuring it out and finding the right balance. Some of it also means you have to determine what else to remove from the map, but I think we're already doing that consistently when we think about data anyway. So it's just kind of another data point you need to be thinking about and framing it as such. So I also wanted to just highlight that an important workflow add is making sure you're doing QA/QC for testing the contrast across the map. There's a lot of free tools out there. This is just one of many. It's called WebAIM Contrast Checker. You can input the colors, test it. It'll tell you if stuff passes and is compliant. You can test when it's not compliant to find the right color and reincorporate that into your map. Something also that's important, as I noted like 30 seconds ago, is remove what might be superfluous, because when you're trying to make sure that you're having enough contrast and enough ways of providing means of low vision support, maps obviously have a lot of information on them, and often base maps online especially come with a lot of stuff because there's so much data and we like seeing it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't need to be there. So really think deeply, especially with online maps, of what should actually be in that. Obviously that means like having some level of customization, but we are all cartographers in this room, so hopefully we are often being involved in the base map creation and be testing the contrast across the board there. So in this example, I just removed all the extraneous information for green spaces because people didn't need to know where golf courses were specifically in this use case, and they also didn't need to know specifically where the beach was. I was just trying to convey where there was kind of recreational space, so I made it all this darker green. And in the same map, in order to remove what was also superfluous, I said that the land didn't need to be gray, it could just be white, and the roads were white in the first on the left, but making the land white and the roads white helped improve my ability to have contrast really be sufficient and like not overwhelming when having the roads still be on the map for reference. And I also additionally increased the width of the casing, as they say, the width of the lines through the roads, and I darkened the roads. And while we're used to trying to make things a little more, I don't know, passive is the wrong word, but sorry, I'm like forgetting other right words. It's good to have higher contrast for labels, as I said. And if you're removing all the extraneous elements, it looks a lot better. I also increased the halos on the right. So I think it looks nice. Personally, I think it's just a different definition of beautiful. More on that later. So here I increase the font size for literally every label on the map, and I'm just highlighting a neighborhood label there. So to summarize, and if people want to take photos, again, I'll share this later. For print and basic web, my list of things you can start with is test color contrast consistently, use more than just color for contrast, remove superfluous things, increase font size, utilize halos, more than white is okay, and use more than just color for meaning. To move on to what is obviously complex, complex maps where you're turning things on and off, where you're panning around the map. As I started the talk with, just think of it as a few potatoes and not all the sacks of potatoes. They are very complex, but if you break things down, you can establish paths forwards, especially because the world of the web has so many people outside of cartography really thinking about accessibility for the user interface elements, like what you're interacting with, like to zoom in on a map, like a timeline, or when you're clicking on the buttons to check something, to add layers, or remove layers. That's all kind of standard web stuff. So you just need to be thinking about that web stuff and define it as part of the map too. My take is anything that we are utilizing in the technological pipeline of data to map creation is just part of cartography. Just like we all say Esri is part of cartography, I assume we should also be thinking about a lot of web elements as just being part of cartography. So you need to think about color in the user interface as well, even if it's not necessarily directly on the map. It is important to make sure that's accessible. There's also, like I said, there's ways to test that. Make sure you're making it a habit. Start at the start of your project, not at the end. It's a lot harder, as we all know, to suddenly make changes if a client last minute requests changes for the entire map. You're also your own client. Make sure you're setting your own standards. And check your color palette at the start to not retrofit. Write alt text, which is technically for not just web, but in websites we're often adding more imagery than we are in a print map, from pop-ups to part of the web interface where the map is included. Make sure that you are taking the time to write alt text. What's really great is there are organizations that are map specific that write map descriptions for you that are experts in that. Unidescription is one. I only had the opportunity to talk to them and find out about them literally a month ago. So this is just an example of continuing to do active research and trying to find these resources does bear fruit. And if we all are doing it collectively and sharing, then we'll eventually have a lot more resources to share. Make form controls accessible. The form controls are the radio buttons, the input fields, the checkboxes, the info icons. Accessible meaning that you're making sure to label them and also making sure to label them in the code. And these are all standard web things, so there's a lot of documentation around how to do that. And when I say making it accessible for the labels, it's so that you can make sure that screen readers can read it when people are navigating through a website who need to use screen readers. So if you didn't correctly label something, or you didn't label something at all, like an icon, then they're not going to know what it is. So label can be icons plus labels, so you can make sure it's actually labeled next to the icon in your user interface, or you can not have a visible label like that little home button icon, as long as you're making sure there's a tooltip on there that can be read via the screen reader. That's called an ARIA tooltip. Again, there's a lot of resources that explain that, and I'm not diving in deeply because I only have 20 minutes, but there's a lot of stuff out there that explains how to do this. And I'm really happy to talk about all of this and connect you with folks too. I'll have my email on my last slide. Another way to make web maps accessible is to create simple form-based filters that work with the map and the data in the map. So the reason why this is accessible is providing a way to keyboard navigate down and filter down the list, so people don't have to actually use the map to pan and zoom to get to where they want to go. You can still, as someone who uses the visual form more, still do it, but it provides another way for people who only have the ability to navigate via keyboard navigation. So here's an example, the National Zoning Atlas that we created. Someone from the National Zoning Atlas is here. So we created accessible drop-down menus to allow people to navigate that that way, we provided clear labeled context of the selection once it was selected, which is another form of just making sure things are accessible. When things are selected visually, we see it. It's important to provide context as well in another way for folks that require text-based navigation. We made sure our checkboxes and radio buttons were accessible with the right labeling and the ARIA tooltips. And then when something was selected, we made sure that it was higher contrast than the other colors in the map, and all the colors we tested in general for high contrast stuff. Text is also perhaps obvious now after I mentioned text previously, a way to attempt to give equivalent experiences to the visual. We do need to do, as cartographers, more research of what actually is equivalent experiences, but this is a way that we can at least attempt to provide it. So providing a text version of the map by having filters, having the data. For this particular map example, it's useful because everything is based off of administrating units and zoning spaces. And as we all know, data is just attribute tables with spatial information. So you can dive in, and especially if you format the data tables to have some of the information that you need, people can utilize the navigation system to get into the data and discover information. So it's another way to do it. Again, keyboard navigation is important so that screen readers can access the data. With all that said, this is certainly not an end-all be-all solution. Exploration maps are hard. There is not currently a perfect way to make sure that maps that are really complex with a lot of ways to interact with a map are immediately accessible. It's still not possible to truly give an equivalent experience for people, especially with patterns and transparencies and analyzing information and live analyses happening. There's just no equivalent experience, but we still have to figure out how to provide that. And something that we have done is reframe it and tell ourselves it's not really hard, because it's not simple, but it also is not deeply hard if you're used to working with data. Is just making sure there's a rich text-based report that provides a somewhat comparable experience to the map. We are used to analyzing data and providing maps and data for reports, so it's not that much harder for us to be able to add that as an additional piece. It does mean that you might need to actually analyze some of the data yourself to provide equivalent experiences, but when there's a lot of information that you're trying to share for good, which is a lot of what we do, we really want to make sure that people have access to it. And as a final option, it's important to provide data download as an option. So if people cannot have the rich text-based experience or other means of exploring the map, at least they have the option to explore the data themselves. So in short, for all of the slides, think outside the visual box. Spatial data is still data. We all see the data tables all the time, so we have to remember to think of it also as data tables, even though we like doing the visual, obviously, as cartographers. And it also is just helpful because people also are not, you still can learn more. Some people might be better at reading information as well, even if they are people who can understand and utilize the visual map. And people have different learning styles. So it also is helping more than just low vision and blind folks. So in summary, for the more complex stuff, make sure user interface designs are accessible, incorporate contrast testing as well, make sure the form controls in your interactive maps are accessible, find non-visual alternatives where possible to help support navigating and understanding what's there, and to repeat, think outside the box, which obviously is hard because we don't know where the box ends or where other things begin, but that's why we're all here, to talk to each other. And I have other tips and tricks about upskilling. Obviously, please update your workflows where you can and start small and then grow and figure out what you can do. But there are some courses that exist that are really useful, like ADA Great Lakes and the Ally Collective are really great resources that we have found. If you have the capacity to, do hire experts, because obviously learning from experts is how you're going to learn more. Sarah Fossheim is someone that we found that is an expert in data visualization, accessibility design, and they are not an expert in map accessible design, but data visualization and interactive data visualization has a lot of overlap. So they're really integral in helping to upskill our interactive team and being able to quickly learn in just a couple months instead of longer. Also find resources, share them. These are links to resources that my team has found and shared. Talk to each other. And tips and tricks. Use existing tools to evaluate things as well. These are existing tools to evaluate web things. A screen reader is something that you should test and see what it's like. PDF, Adobe PDF stuff has ways of analyzing PDFs too. The biggest tip is make sure you're making time, which I know is the hardest for all of us, and it's often why we're asking how to do things and start things. But just make sure you're making time for yourself and for your team. And also understand tool limitations, like see what the limitations are so that we can find ways around it if possible. I think the hardest thing for all of us is making accessible maps, like I mentioned before, is something that we find hard to do because we want to make it really beautiful. And when things have more contrast and more text, it feels cluttered. And for our definition of cartographic beauty and aesthetics today, that isn't really aligned with what we believe is, peak beautiful in cartography today. But to that, I say, we did not always make maps like we do today. For folks who don't know, my thesis was on defining styles in the history of cartography. And most of my previous talks probably talk a lot about them if you ever want to watch them. And so I know a lot about the production methods of the past and how we definitely didn't make maps the way we do today. And anyway, and it changed constantly. It changed over the course of 20 years or 100 years. And we can certainly say that today, what we do today is not the same as what we did 20 years ago. What I do today is not the same as what I did 5 years ago. And we obviously included a lot more elements in the map then. And this is definitely a lot of contrast and texture, but we love these maps. So I think it's all about us reframing what we think is good or not good. Today we use all these softwares. I'll not name all of them because I have, 3 minutes left probably. But I really want to highlight that we're used to finding tools that are not inherently geospatial. Adobe Illustrator is something that we not only use immensely, but we got Esri to change how they have their systems and incorporate Adobe for Esri because of how much they saw us doing stuff. And that's happening constantly. And the more that we do things, we affect the software industry. We have the ability to change the way that the systems exist. And we just need to say what we want, and then softwares that exist will do it because they see that it's wanted, and then people will come out and make new things because that's just what people do who are really smart, like people in this room. And Blender was talked about a lot, this NACIS for terrain. We didn't used to use Blender in the 1980s, but we do now. For anyone who's worked on interactive maps, Flash used to be the thing. I learned everything about Flash in undergrad, and then I had to stop using it, and that was terrible, and I was devastated to have to learn HTML and CSS and JavaScript, but it turns out that's really great now. Everyone loves it. And because we know that, we can work across industries and not just work in map stuff. Data viz is not map stuff only. And just to reiterate, we did not always make maps today, and it also includes data. This is a photo from, I'm not sure when, but it's clearly not a computer from today. It is ArcInfo. It is clearly not a computer that could handle processing the amount of data that we work in today. So beyond design, everything has changed. So I also want to remind that we have Color Brewer, which is amazing, and this is a tool that we constantly reference for color accessibility, and it shouldn't be the only tool that we're referencing. We should be making more tools, we should be involved in doing it, and we should be affecting software companies to do more. So I want to say that we have the power to do all of this, and I want to pose the question, are beautiful accessible maps hard? Or is it just that the direct path is unknown? And that's the hard part. Because technologies change and aesthetics change, and we get to help define that change, which honestly is probably one of the first times in the history of cartography that we get to, because often the history of cartography changed around the changing production methods in print. We are cartographers, and making accessible maps that are also considered beautiful is possible, and we get to define that. There are different kinds of beautiful, and hopefully people will remember that after today. An accessible map design is just another set of tools and constraints that we get to change. So here's some pitches for the people that love doing research and writing books. I would love for people to do it. ADA, WCAG, cartographic principles, accessible cartography and visualization, semiology of accessible design. I think it's possible that a book can be published that has all of this information. And just like these books did not always exist before, we now reference the Slocum text and Jacques Bertin's information like design Bibles, and we still can do that for accessible design too. We just have the power to become a part of it. So here's a long list of questions that I think we should all ask ourselves together and individually, and just a reminder that we're a community, and that's why we meet, and we can collectively figure out how to do stuff together, and that's why we're here sharing. So what do we already do? I'm sharing stuff. I request others to share things that they do so we can all learn from each other. I'm definitely, like I said, not an expert, but I am trying to be. What knowledge and tools exist in other design spaces that we can incorporate, like Blender, like Adobe Illustrator? We use HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and we act like that's ours, but it's not. But it is ours now. Like, what can we define as ours that exists in other spaces? What is missing from our toolkits that would help more easily produce accessible designs that we can get software companies that we use all the time to incorporate and do? What changes do we need in our GIS software to support accessibility design work? How else can we think outside the visual box to produce similar non-visual experiences? And what else do we need to research? Which is obviously the hardest question of all, because we work inside this box that we've existed in for a long time, but the more we're thinking and asking questions, the more we'll be able to move beyond that. So the final question is, what questions are we not asking? And that's my email in case anyone wants to chat more and stuff.
We do have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Hey, so I'm also working a lot with visual accessibility and trying to kind of translate WCAG guidelines into kind of map-centric language because, as you know, it's not written for our kind of domain, right? So after doing a lot of that translation, you end up in the Wild West again. You know, multi-scale mapping and scale-based coloring and label sizing, to me, feels like kind of like that new frontier. Like, what do you see as our new frontier to define and pin down as accessible design when WCAG or ADA are not thinking that hard about these really niche cartographic subjects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that because for me, I'm also flailing at not knowing how to do things and just trying to figure it out. But I know that asking questions like that is what's going to help us get to some kind of answer. And my real response is the only way to do something is to iteratively try. And sometimes there's failures in that, but we also learn from our failures. Which I know we all have experienced in making maps too. And what's really important, I think, is for us to also share our failures as well as our wins in this space, because otherwise people might be trying stuff separately. And if we share our failures that didn't work, it also means other people who are working on solutions maybe won't try those failures too. Hopefully that kind of answered the question in some way.
All right. Oh, I've got time for one more.
I'm curious about your recommendations for alt text. Should we be focusing on a map title, a description of the map, a literal, like what color coding is included, or like what conclusions we hope they might draw from the map?
That's a good question. So you want the question, oh, well, you had a mic, right? I'm sorry, I'm used to repeating the question. When writing alt text, one is supposed to really trying to give the equivalent experience of what someone is seeing. So I do not think you're supposed to be guiding it to what you want people to conclude. Ideally, it is in some way attempting to describe what is on the map, including the analysis. It's also not ideal to list out everything you see on the map because then it becomes a really, like if you're like, there's 10 states on the map and there's outlines around counties and there's lakes that have XYZ. Like writing a literal description also is not ideal. So it is hard to find the appropriate description, but what is also good is there's a lot of information about how to write the correct alt text description, and it just shifted to searching for how to describe graphics for alt text. And Unit Description is a company that actually does map-based descriptions, and they've worked with National Park Services and other entities to produce thousands and thousands of map descriptions, and they're also academic-based and like did research in it, so they like found a way to find the perfect description, not to like I mean, perfect maybe isn't the right word, whatever. They found appropriate ways of doing so. So I think and they're really interested. Actually, Brett Oppegaard wrote in Slack a few months ago about wanting to touch base with other cartographers to be able to share how to improve that. So if you are interested in having a map-specific conversation, he's a great resource, and he has commented. He's like in Slack. His name's Brett Oppegaard.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Vanessa.